couldn't make it today. Okay, so anyway, um, for next week, we'll divide you up. Um, and one side of the class will essentially organize, we'll put you in a breakout room or something, and you'll organize a response to the question that I propose. You'll have the whole class to do it, right? You'll have the whole class to plan your strategy, figure out, what kind of literature that we've looked at you might want to make reference to. Remember, your arguments are not your opinion. Your arguments should be informed by the things we've been studying all term, okay? And then the rest of the cohort will be in more or less an opposing side. So for example, we might do something where I pose the question maybe, um, what is the value for a newly independent state in acquiring first a strong standing army or exploiting a valuable natural resource? Okay. Now you can see where there might be a case to be made for either one of those with respect to the problematics of sovereignty, the difficulty of development, all the things that we've been in one way or another talking about. One thing we haven't talked about a lot, and the reason why I chose that and will not use it, is we have not talked about um, sort of state sovereignty and the military a lot. But it is something that, I mean, I had a unit that I was going to do on Ethiopia as an example, and I was going to talk about the TPLF in the Tigray province, and I was going to talk about also this rather bizarre intervention of Eritrea, including stay behind Eritreans who apparently are masquerading as Ethiopian soldiers and are monitoring checkpoints and interrupting the flow of aid and doing all kinds of strange things. Um, we lost a week of the term, and so I thought it took more background than would make sense of. B, it's an unfolding situation, and I'm always concerned about appearing to be overly biased for or against a side or something like that. So on the one hand, it's timely and it would have been relevant. It is something you might want to keep an eye on if such things interest you. But on the other hand, for the reasons I've explained, I've decided not to do it. But it also brings into focus some of what we'll deal with today in the despotism and deferred development. In other words, the development plan that a newly independent Eritrea chose for itself that involved becoming per capita the most heavily militarized country in the world other than North Korea. Okay, and that has implications for the kinds of things we're talking about. So what I'll do is we'll meet next week. I'll propose a question. Okay, the area of research we're going to be doing. Here's what we're going to be concerned about, and then you'll pick a side. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the possible responses can be, but I'll frame it in such a way that there, I hope, will be obviously sort of contradictory responses. Then I'll put half of you in one breakout room, half of you in another breakout room. I'll probably bounce back and forth between the breakout rooms because obviously you don't want to let the other side in on what your debate strategy or whatever is going to be, your diplomacy. Okay, and we'll develop for each side some suggestion of concepts we might want to think about, maybe some literature you might want to go back and take a second look at. There are a variety of ways in which you can participate in this. It's always the case that there are going to be somebody in a class like this, some cohort of people who just are not comfortable speaking publicly. That's fine. Then your job most likely will be, okay, you're going to be, as the people who are comfortable speaking are presenting the argument for your side, you're going to be keeping notes, but also if you have suggestions for things they might want to consider, you can use a private chat to whoever's talking and say, hey, try this argument. This, you're losing them with this argument, try this. There are a lot of ways that you can kind of pitch in there. When you break off into separate rooms, okay, which you will do for most of next week's class, and then probably the first 15 minutes or so of the week 10 class. That's where the people who, particularly the people who are not going to be presenting, are not going to be speaking, that's where your work is going to be done. Okay. Now, what you're then going to do, there isn't a written component of this assignment, okay, which I suppose it will have to be due by Friday. You know what? We could probably push it to Saturday because I don't think my grades have to be in until Monday night. I'll have to think about that. I'll get your sense of that. But all I want you to do, and I will put a prompt up there when it's relevant to do that. Okay, and there will be at this point, I've got these 5 specific things that I want you to be keeping track of. And again, these will be available to you next week. So don't worry about writing them down now. But I want you to think about overall the general nature of the debate with respect to the principle under debate, what was being debated, and what principle or principles did it invoke. Did it invoke some questioning of a certain notion of what development is or ought to be, or what sovereignty is, or what independence means, or whatever. um, so just generally, what was the debate about? Okay, and what, if anything, was the ultimate resolution? It could be as simple as, which side do you think won, who had the more convincing argument, and why? Okay, but remember, in just a sentence or two, this is very brief, but I always want to get feedback from students when we do these debates. The second thing is that what was your specific role in the debate? What did you do? Okay. Um, did you help primarily in preparation? Were you a note taker as well? Because I'm assuming everyone will have multiple responsibilities. So, kind of, what was your role? And then I'd like you to give me a sense of if anyone in your group was conspicuous, either let's be honest about this, either by virtue of what they did well, or maybe what they did less well, such that the group was either really helped by that or perhaps not helped so much by that. Then in terms of whatever you're willing to say about that. But particularly, I'm most interested in people you think did a particularly good job, either of arguing for your side or arguing against your side. Um, then I want you, the last 2 things, I want you to give me your estimation of an overall letter grade that you would see assigned to your group on the basis of how effective your presentation was. Just an aggregate group grade. If everybody had to get this grade, I think on average we earned this. And then the final thing is, what do you think your grade should be? Okay, it's always interesting for me to see how people evaluate the work of their colleagues and how they evaluate their own work. Now, again, I'm not asking you to remember that, but is it clear what I'm asking you to do as far as the written assignment? You don't have to do any additional reading. You don't have to make specific reference to any of the readings. Everything that you're writing, and it will be brief, will be just summarizing your impressions of the in-class debate, including the preparation for it in week 9 and the ultimate delivery of the discussion in week 10. Does that make sense? Okay, it's a pretty straightforward process. Some of you have already done this in other classes of mine. Generally, I think people enjoy it. It's a nice break because, again, if you don't feel like talking, find other ways to contribute, be useful to people in other ways. That's fine, okay? But also, I think it gives everybody a little bit of a breather. A lot of you are going into much more intensive finals and things like that. And some of you are getting ready to graduate. And there's the whole thing about, well, what now what, and all that. By the way, no, don't worry about that. You waste time worrying about now what. So that's what we're going to be doing. In general, any questions about how that's going to work? Okay, well, if you have questions, and most importantly, if you find yourself feeling uneasy or concerned about it, okay, it's easy for me to say you shouldn't be. But if you are, if for some reason you're thinking, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here, send me an email if you want to talk about it on Zoom, or I can just reassure you over email or explain to you in more detail, respond to your questions. Just let me know, okay? I like to bring the term in for a soft landing on things like this. You've had to encounter a lot, for most of you, or a lot of new ideas, a lot of very complicated and sometimes contradictory ideas. It can be a little bit exhausting. So by the time you get to the last couple of weeks of class, there is that risk that everybody's going to be a little fried. Sometimes this kind of wakes people up a little bit, and it gives you a chance to finish strong. All right. So if you have any more questions about that, as I say, shoot me an email. And I'll either answer them by email, or if you want to meet by Zoom, we can do that. Any other questions on anything else? There obviously is technically no final exam. In a sense, these presentations are an in-class final because they show me what you've learned, because there's no better indication of what you've learned than your ability to apply it in some way, okay? So in other words, it's not going to be a very compelling argument, if all I get is personal opinions, okay, that's going to fall pretty flat. So you are going to want to make reference. You might want to go back, for example, and look at the earlier papers that you presented, particularly if you did well on them, and maybe you'll get ideas from them. Okay. Share those ideas with your colleagues. This is collective work. This is not individual work. That, in this class, you've done enough individual work and you've done some collaboration on some of the presentations, but this is also a test of your ability to collaborate with people to present a coherent worldview and compel the other side to consider that view, because it's the kind of thing that's done all the time when people are negotiating terms of trade, when people are negotiating maybe debt forgiveness, or any number of things, trade agreements, military alliances, whatever, is that there will be a team of negotiators. So it's a little bit of a chance for you to do that. Okay. All right. So let's just take these in order. The first article is this one on colonialism and development. What do you want to tell me about that? Who wants to start?
I can start if you want, Shelby. Okay. So I think the main point on colonialism and development was to kind of evaluate the relationship between colonialism in the past and its legacy and development. And I think what the author really gets at is that development was really shaped by colonialism, and the past ideas of colonialism, of a superior inferior relationship with countries in the global south, is kind of almost perpetuated by development, and that development, the ideas of that today are very similar to the ideas of colonization. But the author also points out that so development was influenced by colonialism, but colonialism did not always end up with a developmental state, and that there are still challenges and like failed states that colonialism had influenced.
Okay, that's a good start. That's a good flyover of the article. Can we fill in? There are some things to fill in there, like you used some terms that we need to think about. You used the term, development state. You used different kinds of terms. You used the term colonialism. I'm not sure that you really explained very precisely what you mean, but there are two of you.
You want to jump in, Shelby?
But that was
Sure.
a good start.
So there's one example in the article that the author states that colonialism, in the global south, which is a big focus within the article, it's perceived as the worst calamity to befallen them. So colonialism within the global south, it was more negative than positive. It gave them a lot of issues. Like within development, there were issues like, let's see. Like he brought up Western arrogance of superiority and different things like that. And colonialism, because it's structured around the idea of eliminating ways of life and introducing a social regulations and reproduction of hierarchy, it is lacking in a lot of different other things. So let's see.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I don't want to interrupt you right now.
So there was a point in the beginning, more towards like page 7 and 8 of the article, where the author was explaining modernization theorists and how they thought of Washington's consensus, and through that, the structural adjustment of the South stimulated by development.
Do you know what they mean by structural adjustment?
So like changes to the political structures and things of that nature, like dependency theory and different things of like that, and the way that they the way that structures have created dependencies and different things in that way. Or am I off?
Okay, well, I understand the confusion there. Okay. and you're close. But first of all, this notion of what has variously been called the Washington Consensus. Now, obviously, they mean Washington, D.C., and that's modernization theory. Modernization theory, a couple of the articles we've looked at have kind of touched on it, but I think particularly the dependency and globalization article, some of the globalizers are part of the Washington Consensus, and they look at globalization as essentially benevolent. That it's that high tide lifts all boats and that kind of stuff. The essential development model probably was most clearly laid out by a guy by the name of Walt Rostow. And Walt Rostow, who was in the Kennedy administration, developed this model of almost automatic development, beyond a certain point, almost automatic development, let's say inevitable development. So the first assumption is that development is progress. Okay, so it's very progress oriented. But linked to that is the second assumption. Progress means becoming more like the West. In terms of colonialism, it means emulating the colonizer, right? And now that, Shelby, is what was meant. You mentioned that idea of people being encouraged to sort of abandon cultures or abandon identities. We have to be clear about this, okay? For the most part, colonialism was not about people. It was about treasure, okay? Remember that in most of the world, the first colonizing operations were economic operations. They were commercial operations. Most obviously with British imperialism, despite the fact that Great Britain had this sprawling empire, it was only relatively late in the game that the British Crown and the British military took over the administration of British colonial possessions. They were originally established and maintained by private commercial actors. Okay, so I don't want there to be confusion about this. And the article could lead you to a confused outcome with respect to the aim of colonialism. It was not to conquer people, but people were in the way of progress. This is, again, the model of modernization theory, the so-called Washington Consensus, is that there is a linear trajectory, a linear path to progress. That's development. That is, you move from a traditional society to a modern bureaucratic society. You move from personal rule to impersonal, equal under the law rule and, administrative rule and things like that. That you move from a society that's organically collectivist to one that values the individual and celebrates, individual sovereignty, things like that, individual rights. These are relatively modern post-Enlightenment assumptions about what social, political, and economic development looks like. You obviously move toward industrialization and capitalism. Okay, so that's the Washington Consensus. Now, why would that be? Both of you suggested in one way or another that this was looked at as this kind of catastrophe for the so-called global South. If it has it been a catastrophe for the United States? Has it been a catastrophe for Western Europe? Why would it be a catastrophe for the global South, but not then let's turn it around, the global North? What's catastrophic about that, according to this article? And again, it's generalized here. It's not very specific. What's the nature of the catastrophe?
There was a section in page 11 that was about development and aid and like historical legacies leading like through aid. And one was Colonial Development and Welfare Act of Britain. And they were explaining that it made a way for post-independence roles for imperial power in the affairs of development of the global South. So that's something that affected them in such a way. Like another example is colonial development policies, land tax, property ownership for colonial regimes.
Okay, I understand that these are changes.
Mhm.
Why would they be? In other words, do you ever
Yeah.
think twice about the property you own and whether or not that's catastrophic? Okay, I mean, what's the matter with private ownership of land?
Well, I think a lot of it was in favor of Western development and like getting more resources towards Western development.
Right.
And that just how with colonization, it was about the treasure and the resources.
Mhm.
Development is almost like a way for that to continue happening, just to get more resources and more wealth for that Western ideal.
That's what the desire here is, that you see it from the point of view of the colonized, and that what you're seeing is, wait a minute, you're not coming here to help us, and you're not even coming here to help us develop and be like you. You're not allowing us to do that, because that's not the purpose of colonialism. You're coming here to force us to work for you, to extract from our land where we live kind of stuff that's under our ground or in our water or wherever, and then you're going to take it away, and all, you know, and you're not going to give it back, and you're not going to give us any of it, you know. So it's colonialism. Now, I mentioned earlier that the central aim of colonialism was not about people, it was about treasure. It doesn't mean that it didn't affect people and that it didn't require the exploitation of people as a means to an end. But also, that's capitalism. So this is also the nature of capitalism, that capitalism is extractive. Okay, capitalism is not about sharing things. Capitalism is about getting more than the person next to you, surplus value, profit. Okay, and so the catastrophe, you're both right there. That's why I said you're both close. The catastrophe being talked about here is that it establishes and institutionalizes a couple of things. One of them is the notion of alien rule or alterity. You know, in the decolonization class that I taught in the fall, we talked a lot about that. And it's funny because some students only late in the game really understood what that meant. So the idea is, obviously, when people come from another place and they come to your place and they settle there and they treat it like it's theirs, okay, that's alien rule. But what colonialism institutionalizes is that will be permanent. Even if we tell you you're independent, we still control you, because we still control the terms of trade. We still control the technology transfers that would allow you to develop in a sovereign way. We still control the flow of weapons that you're going to use to kill your neighbors and each other. And we're going to make a profit off that. We control everything. This is classic dependency theory. This is, core periphery, extractive, feed the center, feed the West, feed the North kind of dependency theory. Okay, and the idea is, as both of you suggested, this is the legacy of colonialism. Okay, now, we've touched on this a little bit, but one of the rejections of dependency theory is, well, wait a minute. You say, yeah, dependency theory and this and that, it sounds good until I show you examples of where that didn't happen. And I show you South Korea, and I show you Singapore, and I show you Taiwan, and maybe I show you what's happening in Vietnam right now. I mean, Vietnam is an incredibly dynamic economy right now, but it's nothing like those. So those are exceptions to the rule. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to say that those countries or Singapore, all of which at one point or another have been colonized by somebody, right, that they're not really essentially in the core now. They're not peripheral. They're not just, we're not just pulling raw material resources and cheap labor out of those places. They're making high-end durable finished goods, for the rest of the world. We've already dealt with that, especially with those particular countries. Why is that not necessarily an obvious rejection of the kind of dependency theory that's being discussed in this article? In particular, think of the discussion we had last time about the American support for the development state, but only in some circumstances. This is really important. Kyle, do you have your hand up? I can't.
Yeah.
Go
Is
ahead.
that because the idea that the Japans and Singapores and South Koreas, they still all benefit the core? Is that the point?
Elaborate.
Oh, as in the idea is that these states are still made not to benefit themselves, but to benefit the core and uphold their own power and their own kind of power struggle and dynamic.
Well, I think we have to be honest that they would all be considered core states, particularly Japan. Japan is in the core. It's in the G8. or the
Yeah, yeah,
G7
yeah.
plus
So I,
one.
was, I don't think the G8 exists. I was
But
like,
you know what I'm saying? For a while,
yeah,
it was
yeah.
the G8, and then we came to our senses and told Russia to go screw itself. But it's the idea, remember, was that those particular cases, particularly Asia, were of especial concern to the United States in terms of anti-communism and the Cold War. Okay. Sub-Saharan Africa, much less so. Much less so. It wasn't that we weren't concerned about communism in Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. Obviously, we were concerned about it enough in Southeast Asia to throw 58,000 American lives and however many millions of Vietnamese lives away, thinking that we were defeating communism, whatever the hell that meant. But the idea was that because China emerged after 1949, initially, mistakenly, the Washington Consensus was that China emerged in 1949 as essentially a large satellite of Soviet socialism. That there was this, this single, communism, this single block of communism. That was never true, but it took Washington a while to realize that China was ultimately fighting, as it had been for centuries, to regain and preserve its sovereignty, and communism was the model it was going to use for that. It has, we now can see, it has done that, and it has done it very successfully, much more so than Russia. Okay, but Latin America, we didn't have to use that big development state in quite the same way. The states in those systems were older. Latin American countries had been nominally independent for much longer. They had established modern bureaucratic states. Yes, they were prone to corruption and instability and all kinds of other things. But it's hard for us to remember that during the Second World War, one of the most dynamic economies on the planet was Argentina. Okay, so there were periods of time where those were becoming developed countries. But dependency theorists say, yeah, becoming but never became. Look at Brazil. Every 5 years, there's a new model that says that Brazil is going to emerge as one of the world's dominant economies, and then it falls flat. Or Poland. Poland's going to emerge as one of the world's dominant economies because they have this highly skilled workforce, highly educated, heavily industrialized, and yet they keep stumbling over their own feet. What's going on? Okay. This is that persistence of that notion of underdevelopment. It also suggests something that outside the Washington Consensus is not often considered. And I've sort of been stared at sideways when I used to bother to go to conferences by suggesting there was a model of underdevelopment in the Comintern as well. Bulgaria is underdeveloped. Romania is underdeveloped. Certainly Poland is underdeveloped relative to the Soviet Union and relative to the rest of Europe. They're underdeveloped economies. They're underdeveloped political systems because they were warped and corrupted by being controlled by a single dominant core power, the Soviet Union. Okay. I'm going to suggest something that a lot of people on the left don't like to admit, that was simply another model of underdevelopment. Yes, Caden, the Soviets did do that intentionally, just as did the West. The British intentionally underdeveloped various parts of the world. So did the Soviets. You see what I'm saying, though? In other words, this isn't like good guys, bad guys. These were models of what happens in various kinds of colonial or neo-colonial or semi-colonial exploitations of people. You're working for us now. Your resources are ours now. There were periods of time, for example, during the 1970s, when Poland, which was an absolute breadbasket country. Poland is a physically beautiful country with a lot of farmland. They produce a lot of food. But people would go to the stores in Warsaw or Krakow or Gdansk or wherever, and the only thing there might be on would be like rows and rows of bottles of vinegar, and the food would be gone. Where did the food go? Take a guess.
Not to Poland.
No, not Poland. Where did it go? Went to Russia, went to the Soviet Union. Okay. And so that's a classic extractive, kind of economy. That's like colonialism. It's a catastrophe. Okay. So what I'm trying to get you to think about, kind of broadening the scope of that analysis so that this isn't just a critique of capitalism and it isn't just a critique of the West. Okay. The same thing was happening in Eastern Europe, primarily as a consequence of Soviet domination of the so-called Eastern Bloc. Call it what you want. You can call it Soviet socialism. It's colonialism. Okay, it's still colonialism. It's a slightly different model, but it's still colonialism. Okay. Any other? That was a good summary. That was a complex argument. Good summary. Anything else that you would add before I finish making notes?
I was just going to add kind of what you were saying, like the extraction of the economies that like the article did talk about on page 12 and 13 about colonial attempts to like destroy industries in the colonies to, keep them underdeveloped.
Well, now be clear about that, because that makes it sound like they went around, burning down factories.
Oh, okay. Well,
which isn't quite what they mean there.
Yeah. On page, let's see. Yeah, on page 12, it says, noted the use of British colonial policy to suppress the price of cocoa in Ghana, and then it goes on to talk about the heinous rape of the Congo, and the colonial policies that kind of destroyed the industries. So they did it through policy and through economic policies to like suppress the economy.
Well, the idea was, even if the intent wasn't to do that, the effect was that happened. Like if you look at the Congo, for example, you find there an estimated value within the DRC, for example. The estimated value of the mineral wealth there, I think conservatively, is about $25 trillion. Okay, that's a big game. Now I've seen various estimates, but I'm thinking that's a ballpark, not very wild estimate. Okay, much more valuable, for example, than Saudi oil. We're talking about strategic metals, we're talking about diamonds, we're talking about all kinds of things. Okay, but the country has been in a state of constant instability and disarray for decades. Okay, civil wars, banditry, all kinds of things. What the authors here are trying to say, I think the point that Maria's trying to make, is that colonialism not only did not try to stop that, it didn't. In some cases, it contributed to it. Okay, when you're going in and you're telling people, we don't care what you do to these people, just go in and get us those diamonds, go in and get us that gold. We don't care. Okay, this is a private operation. No one's going to know that was what happened. So that, again, think of that as something that becomes, 1 second, Shelby, it becomes institutionalized. It becomes something that generationally people grow up in and realize this is the reality on the ground. No one cares about the law, because no one ever did. Because it wasn't about the law, it was about getting resources out of the ground. Yeah, so I'm sorry, Shelby.
I was just going to add that in page 13, he did state people being robbed, like the societies being robbed of their indigenous efforts to develop. So through colonialism and colonial rule, they were unable to develop in the way that they could have if they had a different system.
Well, either if they had a different system, or if they were, in many cases, if they were actually allowed the assistance necessary to industrialize, to build an infrastructure, to build an educational infrastructure for human capital, to do all the things that all of the Western powers had done to become wealthy. If they had been allowed to do that, it wasn't like they had to choose another way. Now, some of them wanted socialism, or they wanted,
and if they weren't stripped of resources.
But yeah, we can do that, except of course you've stripped out everything that we could have used as value to build that infrastructure. How did you do it? Well, you guys signed papers with us. Yeah, but you didn't tell us what we were signing for. Well, you should have known. This is what happened in Iran when British Petroleum went in and essentially negotiated under extraordinary pressure, pretty much complete control of Iranian oil. When Mossadegh came to power through a free and fair election, right? He nationalized it. He wanted to stop it. So the United States, brand new Central Intelligence Agency, conspired with the British and British intelligence and with, dissidents locally, many of whom were, frontally terrorists. They had him arrested and they allowed him to die. We fomented a coup and then installed the line of Shahs again, installed the Shah of Iran. We did that not because of liberty or democracy, because Iran had none of those things. We did it because it gave the British back some control over oil, the terms of trade. So that's Shelby, that's kind of what they were talking about there. It's like, no, you can't even have our system, because that would mean we would have to compete with you. And we're not going to do that. So there was that too. Again, this is the imperative both of capitalism and of Soviet-style socialism. Neither one of those systems stands up terribly well to real cutthroat competition. If you don't think that's true, just look at the tendency toward monopoly and monopsony in the United States. Look at the rise of Amazon, and before that, the rise of Standard Oil or anything else. When there's a valuable resource or a valuable market, capitalism tends to be a rush to concentrate in the center. Look at American media. 40 years ago, there was a multiplicity of independent media companies in the United States. Now everything is owned by about four different companies. There's a tendency toward concentration. That's not competition. So it's an odd kind of capitalism. So that's kind of, Shelby, that's what they're talking about there. That's a great point. And just picked you up another half a point to a point on your observations. Okay. I do actually keep scores, as goofy as that is. All right. Any other questions? I think that was quite good. Yeah. It's an interesting article. It's a point
I liked
of
the
view.
different look, the third world look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
it
think
was
that's
different.
necessary. I think, when I was in undergraduate, certainly when I was in high school, that perspective never would have been articulated. No one was really allowed to argue that. Now it's kind of like, yeah, let's take a crap on capitalism in social science terms. Okay. As Jello Biafra said, it's fun to hate. All right. What about despotism and deferred development? This is obviously a problematic article. Partly because I wrote it, but don't worry about it. It ultimately, just so you know, was considered to be unpublishable when the publication I submitted it to. I don't know how much I explained about that, but I had like a weekend to put together a retrospective on Eritrea after decades of independence and what had happened. And it's a cluster, and it still is to this day. It's still dysfunctional. I don't think there's a single thing that's in that article that doesn't still obtain, unless it's gotten worse today. Okay. But I had some ferocious exchanges usually with Eritreans who had been part of the EPLF and now with PDRF, and it was like threats of violence and like, that stupid kind of, I'll kick your ass, to which, me, it was like, yeah, okay. Sure, pal. That sounds like political science. But no, ultimately I wouldn't make the changes that were demanded by the editor, which would have changed completely the entire tone of the article. And so it never got published. And that's been kind of my story with publication, which is why I'm kind of tired of it. But anyway, that's the genesis of the argument. In the article. All right, who wants to start with that?
I'll start.
Okay, so go ahead.
Okay, so for the most part, what this article kind of talks about is how there were some optimistic views about Eritrea becoming like the next Africa's next Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
But it was basically, there were a lot of political decisions made that kind of distorted and kind of stalled the overall social and economic development. And these were like the consolidation of political power, the repression of the people, and the overall reliance on mineral exports.
The last one, the mineral exports, might not be clear there, what I'm talking about. There were surveys done and there was exploration, but none of that had gone online yet.
I kind of understood a little bit of it as far as the mineral exports. And I think the other part was the overall indifference Eritrea had with its international geopolitical image and with business communities, and overall their decisions on this stuff kind of stalled their overall chances of long-term economic and political stability.
Yeah, I think that's, if I had to summarize it in a sentence, it would sound something like that. Yeah. On the other hand, we'll go on from there, but keep in mind that the dilemma for this kind of thing is there is, in that defiance, there is very much the spirit of the EPLF. There is that idea that this is what ultimately defeated Ethiopia. That same kind of defiance of, no, you can't tell us what to do. We fought 30 years for this. We're going to do it our way. So there was that idea, we're going to go on our own. We're not going to, compare this to the last general article. This is the attempt of the newly ensconced or imposed Eritrean state not to pursue that global South development track, not to fall into that. What's the problem with it though? Because again, it's hard to blame this on colonialism. The issue here isn't really necessarily that. I mean, there is a kind of colonial legacy with Eritrea, that it was briefly colonized by Italy under the fascists, and well, it sort of was. But it was more that it was an annexed territory of Ethiopia, which technically was never colonized. So this isn't quite the same. What I want you to think about, the reason why I included this piece was, this is a peculiar, maybe not unique, but it's a peculiar developmental trajectory, because it isn't the classic case, like what Shelby and Maria were talking about, of an exploited colonial territory that was stunted from the beginning and never had any real chance to, achieve the kind of modernization trajectory that, Walt Rostow and the Washington Consensus expected. Okay. What else?
Okay, so I didn't know I had someone else presenting with me, so I don't know what else.
There's quite a bit.
Yeah. So one issue with that you wrote about was the combination of endless service. You were talking about parts of the EPFL's original blueprint for their government. It kind of still is one of the reasonings for their kind of exploitative use of their people, kind of like a strong military or someone who's not reliant on other countries. So the combination of endless service and use of labor is one of the biggest reasons for Eritrea's young, urban, and educated individuals to immigrate to places like, if they're studying abroad that is funded by, they don't really want to come back because of these issues. So it leads to, there isn't much possibility for economic development because you're not getting those people focusing back into your country.
Right. I'm glad you got that, because some people haven't given that adequate consideration. The term for that, by the way, is brain drain.
Brain drain, yeah.
Yeah. I probably should have clarified that. This was a first draft, but even still, I look at it now and I cringe a little bit, because I should really have made that clearer. That was a tremendous loss of talent, of Eritrean talent, indigenous Eritrean talent, highly educated, motivated, and yet lost. It's also, the other thing I was hoping that someone might jump on was this notion of the remissions and things like that. There's a lot of countries do this, where it's sometimes referred to as diasporic remittance transfers. Okay, and I talk about that a little bit on page 2 and 3, and I talk about it a little bit elsewhere. The idea that, and this is extraordinary, there isn't another country in the world, possible exception of the Philippines for a while, that is more dependent for the global earnings of the country, right, on remittances from people outside the country. That is, there are actually requirements for people to retain Eritrean citizenship that they send a certain amount of their earnings back to Eritrea. Okay, they what's called repatriating. But in addition to that, and all during the war and in the immediate aftermath, particularly up until the suspension of the Constitution and everything, a lot of Eritreans, a lot of the Eritrean scholars I knew, a couple engineers and people like that, very successful people, were voluntarily sending back thousands of dollars to Eritrea. And that was an enormous part, as much as a third of their GDP was just citizens out in the world, hence diaspora, who were sending money to the country. That's a weird way to make money if you think about it. Okay. Now the question then is why? Remember, as both of you pointed out, these were choices of the Eritrean state. This wasn't like Britain or the United States or the Soviet Union coming in and saying, okay, now you have to do this our way. These were sovereign choices of a dictatorial government, an autonomous state. Okay, why? What were they trying to avoid?
Dependency on other countries.
Yes, yeah. Now there was we had an interesting email exchange, and I'm not sure that I really clarified that for you, but the idea was what they didn't want to do was be subject to the pressures of things like structural adjustment. Okay, they didn't want the IMF coming in and telling them, you are not sovereign, you have to change these policies, or we won't renegotiate your loans, or we won't give you more money. That's that debt trap, that debt dependency. Because the dilemma of, I'm sorry for the alliteration, the dilemma of debt dependence is you're really not independent. You're dependent on the debtor nations or their multinational banks like the World Bank and the IMF. Right? If you don't get those infusions of capital, your economy can't function. So you're not really sovereign at all. Okay. And they were trying to avoid that. In other words, one of the things I wasn't trying to suggest here was what a bunch of assholes. I can see the brutal logic of it, the kind of Machiavellian logic of it. Like, look, this is what we have to do. But they failed miserably at most of it. So this is, again, the reason why I chose this is part of that dilemma of development. They want to develop. They don't want to be capitalists, but they want to industrialize. They want to get those extractive operations going. They want to take advantage of the wealth that's under the ground in Eritrea. They also, unlike Ethiopia, they have access to pretty good ports. That's important for trade and things like that. I can't remember now in this draft if I mentioned the sort of free trade zones they were going to establish and things like that. I thought that I did, but I don't remember now. Yeah.
Oh.
Let's see. Yeah.
You do for a little bit.
Yeah, it was a flyover on that because at that time it was a new policy at that time. So the idea was they wanted to control everything. They wanted to control the terms of trade. They wanted to control the access to what they had under the ground. They wanted to control their ports. They wanted to be sovereign. They wanted to be independent. Okay, because they fought for 30 years to be independent. But this shows you, how very difficult it is to do that. I mean, if you think about this, okay, for example, where is this? I think it's page 14. Yeah. I asked the question, are they defiant, which is sometimes laudable, or are they self-destructive? Okay. And this is, I think, where I got into a lot of trouble with the Eritreans, is that they read this as me saying, you guys are shooting yourself in the face. You're abject failures because you've done everything stupidly, which is not what I'm saying. Okay. But when you look back on page, gosh, I think it's page 2, but let me go back. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, page 3. I make a list there. I took this from EPLF documents, of which I have copies, okay, and have had for decades. They're all yellow, right? The things that I think I cited a source there, I think it was Sherman and Rubio, but Ruthie had actually given me copies of these years ago, like when the, right when they were wrapping things up. Establish a people's democratic state. Well, there's nothing democratic about Eritrea. Okay. Build an independent, self-reliant, and planned national economy. Now, however much a failure it has been, there's some of that has actually been done. Okay. Develop culture, education, technology, and public health. Very little of that has been done. Okay. Safeguard social rights, emphasizing workers' and women's rights. None. Ensure the equality and consolidate the unity of nationalities. Always problematic. Build a strong people's army. Yeah. The largest per capita in the world, other than North Korea. Okay. Respect freedom of religion and faith. Open question. That depends on how you interpret it. Humane treatment to prisoners of war. Encourage the desertion of the idea there was to repatriate Eritreans who have been fighting for Ethiopia. They kind of did that, but then they didn't pay them. They went for 2 years with nothing but maybe food. Well, you can't, these were young people, a lot of them, a lot of energy and a lot of potential, and all you're giving them is not very good food. Protect the rights of Eritreans residing abroad? No, they can't. They can't project force in any way at all. Respect the rights of foreigners residing in Eritrea? No, it's a dangerous place. Okay. Pursue a foreign policy of peace and non-alignment. Complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. They have been, in many ways, the most corrosive belligerent in the Horn of Africa. Constantly. Yeah. So that's what I mean when I say their failure to do those things is not just pressure from outside. It is disproportionate consequence of decisions they make. I mean, you wanted to write your own script, Eritrea, you're writing it as we speak. You've got the same guy as the head of state who was leading the EPLF 30 and more years ago, and that doesn't sound like democracy, and that doesn't sound very sensible. One of the complaints of Eritrean soldiers for a few years after the war was, they might be getting food. Well, Isaias and the guys in the government, man, they were partying, they were living large by Eritrean standards, but nobody else was. So there was corruption. Those are choices. Okay. So this is what happens when a fragile, newly independent country doesn't just immediately bow down before the North and capitalism and the European powers in the United States and say, please give us money, we'll play by your rules. One thing about Eritrea, they are not playing by anyone else's rules. They're not. Okay. And that's, you can't hardly say that of anybody. With, again, one of the notable exceptions being North Korea. Okay. But is this development? Insofar as you bother to read this paper, is this development?
I wouldn't say it's development, is specifically because of the constant silencing of media or not. I think that's one of the biggest ones, just how they don't allow any opposing political parties or free media. So it's other people with different opinions on how they could develop is completely shut down. It's they have to do it their way. So I would.
Well, if people are saying we're going to do this our way, that's independence. That's sovereignty.
Well, I mean, in their way of their exploitative ways that have been presented.
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
It's there's other ways that they could develop without being completely cut off from the world. And those opposing views are just completely silenced.
Well, you see, this is the problem though, because if you have, however imperfectly, a centralized development state And that's what democratic centralism is. Forget the democratic. It's supposed to be a people state, all that. But that notion of centralism, that everything emerges from the center, that model was embedded in early EPLF declarations and things. That there was a strain of the EPLF that was always very strongly Marxist-Leninist. Okay, that's still fairly persistent. That's the legacy of not so much colonialism, but a kind of ideological ascension within the EPLF and ultimately within the Eritrean state of a kind of post-Marxist-Leninist centralism, which is, it's not about democracy. It's not about liberalism. I mean, they're rejecting liberalism. So you see what I'm trying to get you to think about is, well, gee, that doesn't seem like development. Yeah, according to whom does it not seem like development? If you silence the media, but the media are irresponsible and decadent, aren't you doing a good thing? I mean, would it be better, for example, if in Eritrea they had lots of, exploitation of women and exploitation of violence and all those nice, healthy Western activities that are clear signs of sophistication and development? I mean, there's just not enough pornography in Eritrea. That's the problem. Understand, people look at that and say, yeah, that's right, that's development, because it's the liberation of the individual. No, it's not. It's the exploitation of individual neuroses at a collective or aggregate level. That's the Eritrean view. Those things are decadent. We can't allow them. On the other hand, we can take our prisoners and we can store them, in storage crates. Because they're prisoners, they're enemies of the state. It's them determining the way they're going to live. Now, remember, I asked early on, what's development? Does it just mean economic change, political change? What does it mean? Ultimately, one way of looking at development is that which advances the cause of your sovereignty most effectively. When you tell the rest of the world to mind its business, the one thing you're doing is declaring sovereignty. Right? You're not going to be a colony of anybody. You're not going to be a tool of anybody. You're not going to be anybody's plaything. You're not going to be Cuba. Cuba was the West's whorehouse for decades. Yeah. A lot of people think that that's exactly what, a lot of particularly white Cubans in Miami and places like that think was great. Those were the good old days when it was run by mobsters and, shysters and dictators. Well, Eritrea is saying, we're not going to live like that. And in whatever else they do, they don't do that. They're not Cuba in the 1950s.
But doesn't that damage the way other states see them as a legitimate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So
well, why should they care?
I guess, yeah.
No, I'm not arguing against you. I'm saying, from their point of view, yeah, and?
Yeah.
They fear intervention? Is it likely that some state, for some reason, say Ethiopia, for example, a coastline, and looking to expand that way to expand their control over the oil trade between that Red Sea, I think it is, that area? Because Somalia is already a failed state and Ethiopia is operating out of that. What's to stop them going in to Eritrea?
Eritrean soldiers or Eritrean bullets.
Yeah.
They've been at war several times since independence.
Yeah.
I mean, Ethiopia's had enough. I mean, that's why this current situation in Tigray province is bizarre, because as far as anyone can tell, Eritrean soldiers crossed into Tigray province either at the invitation of Ethiopians or without Ethiopians stopping them from doing that. That's extraordinary. That would be like the Mexican military crossing over into Texas and Washington, D.C. just kind of looking the other way. mean, they're sovereign states with sovereign militaries. What are they doing? It's bizarre. But part of this is Eritrea has made it clear that for all of the early Marxist Leninism, they also appear to have shown some, it's hard to calibrate, but some solidarity with the old al-Shabaab movement in Somalia and things like that. I mean, they seem to support radicalism. And it seems like their program is less about peaceful development and more about remaining defiant and kind of throwing, sticking their thumb in global capitalism's eye and saying, we're here to annoy you because we can.
Yeah, I got that with your point of like, they don't ever talk about the problem with like human trafficking, and it's like they just don't even mention it when it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, but then see, the question is it hypocrisy? Or is it sort of brutal realism? Is it just like they've decided, no, this is the way we live. This is what we're going to do. You don't have to like it. We're not interested in whether or not you like it. I mean, when was the last time North Korea, for example, tried to be nice to anybody? And some people are arguing Eritrea sees themselves in the same way. We're not here to be nice. We're here to be Eritrea. Because if you think about powerful countries, do we ever stop and think about whether or not the United States is really concerned with whether or not, the rest of the world thinks we're nice? Because a lot of the things we do don't seem very nice. A lot of people are asking that question these days of Israel. Aren't they concerned about the way they look to the rest of the world? And apparently they're not. And when I say Israel, I mean the Israeli state, I mean, there are plenty of Israeli citizens and people in the Jewish diaspora outside of Israel who are appalled by what they're seeing. Even though they may support Israel, they see this as sort of a, crossing a line of some kind, the current violence against Palestinians. And the response from Israel is, well, they're shooting rockets at us. Yeah, most of them, though, never make it anywhere. They're blown up in the air because of the Iron Dome system that was designed with the United States capital and United States know-how. You're a neo-colony of the United States is one of the arguments. My brother actually texted me. I totally politicized this guy. He says, "Hey, didn't you get in trouble once? Like you were in a job interview and you described Israel as the world's largest welfare recipient of military industrialism?" And I said, "Yeah, I thought I was being funny. I didn't get the job, but it's kind of true. Israel presents itself as the Zionist homeland. Okay. And again, this is not a screed about Israel. I'm trying to use them as an example because Eritrea saw itself in many ways as like Israel. It saw itself as surrounded by enemies and adversaries, people have been exploited and everything else. And so this was their chance, but if you think about that, it's like, how much does Benjamin Netanyahu really think about how the rest of the world thinks about Israel? As opposed to the idea of, no, sorry, this is Israel. This is the line we draw is right here. Gaza is ours. The West Bank is ours. What are you going to do about it? Because that's really pretty much Israel's policy. What are you going to do about it? And the reason is because they can. The United States does things like that because we can. Britain used to do things like that because they could. So what Eritrea could be seen as saying is, yeah, we're defying this right. We will defy all of your norms of conduct and right thinking and everything else because we can. So when you read this article, kind of give that some consideration. I'm not asking you to take a side. I don't think there's a good side to take with respect to Eritrea. It's completely problematic. But there is a part of me, however grudgingly, that has to acknowledge, well, they are choosing their own path. And isn't that what sovereignty is about? You You move out of your parents' house. You're going to be your own person now. You're going to make your own decisions, right? And sometimes your parents are going to say, no, you shouldn't do that. But you're like, hey, I'm sovereign. I'm independent. I do what I want to do. You know, and sometimes you'll do things simply to flaunt the fact that you're no longer merely their child, right? But now you're your own person. And I don't mean to compare Eritrea to a child. That's a bad analogy, but you see what I'm saying? That idea of sovereignty. You fight 30 years for something and you finally get it. The very last thing you're going to want to do is be pressured by other people. So it's a difficult situation. Just if you find the article interesting, take a look at it. If not, let it go. What about this question of the global South? What's the global South? We've mentioned that a few times.
All right, so the global South basically refers to all the underdeveloped countries as a whole. And as a quick, brief overview of this, the article's topic is basically a debate of whether or not these countries that are finally developed, not quite fully industrialized like the North, but slightly below them, whether or not they can keep this identity of being a southern country. And due to their varying development levels. And so some argue that these countries that are now being developed, almost industrialized, but not quite, that they'll continue to maintain this North-South relationship and leave behind this identity.
Or, Kat, I'm going to stop you for just a second. I can only understand a little bit of what you're saying. There's something going on with your sound. Is anybody else having a problem with that? Yeah, it's really hard to kind of hear what you're saying.
Sorry, so I tried using these headphones to make it better because I know that my computer's mic itself isn't very great. It's kind of robotic. Not sure how to resolve the issue.
Well, do the best you can.
Okay. So Global South basically refers to the term underdeveloped countries as a whole, but since some of these underdeveloped countries such as India, Brazil, Mexico, China, they've become developed and not quite industrialized like North countries would identify themselves, like the U.S. or in Japan. So they're not quite there, but slightly below them. And so the debate is whether or not these countries can keep their identity of being a global South country or not, due to their varying development levels. And so the argument, so they come up with a couple different theories. Either these developed countries will continue to have a relationship, like a North-South relationship, and leave behind this whole South identity, basically wanting to become industrialized and adapt these policies of industrialization. And so there's another theory being that they either will keep a intra-South relationship. And an example given of that is India and Brazil block in global trading as their approach to development and economic growth. So they basically help out other underdeveloped countries rather than adapting Northern policies. And the way they do this is by analyzing who gets funding from the World Bank and looking at statements about 3,600 paragraphs of text from governments concerning trade and environmental policies. And so after they looked at these at the data, they came to the conclusion that these somewhat what they refer to these countries as basic countries being Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So they look at these statements made for environmental and free trade, basically, trade, environmental policies. And so they came to the conclusion that, sorry, I'm looking at the notes I have here. So they came to the conclusion that 19% of statements in support of were either in support of developmental countries and sorry. So they labeled these statements as 1 to 3. 1 being they're in support of free trade, 2 being they're in support of environmental protection, and 3 being they're pro-South. Any issues concerning them being pro-South. And so 19% of these statements were from high-income developmental countries, 11% of them were from the middle, and 10% of them were from low-income developmental countries. And so
I was muted so that I wouldn't interrupt you. I thought that'd help. It didn't. If we had to conclude, this article sometimes confuses people a bit partly because people are not used to using the term Global South. But what's the most important thing the author wants us to take away from this? When we here are the data, you just described the data and what the results of analyzing the data show. What's the claim here? What does this say about the Global South?
So the claim here is that these countries, basic countries, like I described earlier, they can maintain this identity of being the Global South because they're in support of the other underdeveloped countries, like the lower income countries, the middle income countries. So they're in support of it because these underdeveloped countries are in big support of trade. So they're like trade at all costs to help their economic growth. And then some, the North would debate that they're pro environmental policies because they don't want to compete with these developing countries because they can sell products, goods at lower prices, basically. So they're pro-environmental. And so they're saying that these basic countries being in support of trade for the underdeveloped countries shows that they can maintain this identity of being Global South.
Okay,
and
yeah.
They continue to maintain a relationship only with Global South countries so that they can develop rather than leaving them behind and leaving them to, fall apart. So then they decide who gets funding from the World Bank so that they can help each other out. And they developed a couple organizations to help them out. One of them being the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the other one being the New Development Bank. So these are developed by these Global South countries to help each other out, rather than fully industrializing and adapting Northern policies.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly right. So in other words, I understand we're having a little trouble hearing you, but I think I get the point there. One of the findings here, and it surprised a lot of people who were analyzing this at the time, was that, first of all, there is meaning, as Kat suggested, there's still meaning in the term Global South, because even though some of the countries from the Global South, and most notably China, have experienced, a lot of the indicators that are normally considered to be development, they haven't lost the sense of connection to the rest of the so-called developing countries or the Global South. And China's been a leader in this. China's been a major investor in the Global South. It's been a major, China right now it wants to be a major investor in Eritrea. China is a major investor in East Africa. China's a major investor, the One Belt, One Road thing is ultimately China's development plan for the world. And most of that's going to run right through the Global South that Kat just described. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that the Global South still means something. Okay, but more than that, what Kat was describing there, for those of you who might not be able to pick it up, through no fault of Kat's, is when we look at negotiations, when we look at determinations about, who gets what, when, and how, there's remarkable solidarity within the sovereign states of the global south. They do in some ways comprise a diplomatic bloc, an economic bloc, in terms of the way they vote, in terms of the way they move as a cohort, in terms of, well, what's going to be, not just what's going to be a benefit to me, what's going to be a benefit to us. And that surprised a lot of people, because again, that getting back to what Shelby mentioned as the Washington consensus, is that modernization notion that one of the things about development and everything else is you reach this point of takeoff, and then it's kind of every sovereign state for itself. You're in this arena of healthy global competition and all this kind of stuff. It's in that sense sort of neoclassical. What Kat's suggesting this article says, though, is that hasn't really happened. She mentioned Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, Thailand, South Africa, and a lot of others. Okay, but obviously led by China. Is that these countries that have experienced some measure of what, let's say, Western style industrialization, China's the classic example. They've got a model that's sometimes described as command capitalism. Okay, that is, they've still got the dictatorial state, but they have, because of the massive capital they got from the sort of reacquisition of Hong Kong, they've been able to use that to fuel these industrial expansions and these new ventures in the sciences and research and development. And they're now a major global player. They will soon be the largest economy in the world. And yet, when, what Kat was suggesting is, there's almost a sense of solidarity, even maybe loyalty to other developing countries. And in China's case, that's manifest, because what China's essentially doing is saying, you developing countries are the engine of our ascension to world power. We will invest massive capital in your infrastructure, in your education, and whatever. We'll build your trains, we'll build highways. Now, again, the best jobs are going to go to Chinese workers and things like that. But even still, there will be manifest transformations of your political economies. Okay, you will, I don't want to say you'll be loyal to us as China. You will remember that. You will be informed by that. You will tend to support us on the global stage. So China's been, one of the things that doesn't come out of this article is the really, really important role that China has played in holding this block together, because of where a lot of their investment capital has gone. I mean, it is amazing that just the flow of billions of dollars of Chinese investment into the developing countries that Kat was describing. Okay, and it's not all China, but Kat, I don't know what your reading of this was, or anybody else who's looked at this, or Kyle, as an economist. I don't know how much this would still be the case without China and that massive capital to invest in developing countries, because the United States has kind of backed off of its development, its investments in developing countries compared to the Green Revolution in the 50s and things like that. We don't seem to be investing in the same way. In addition, what do you think?
I don't know. As far as the Belt and Road, I was kind of like, the article seems to mention it a couple of times, but not really put it as a main focus. But I guess that might have been when it was written. But it seems as if the Belt and Road is like, how do I put this? I had like a better idea. Anyway, it seems like the Belt and Road is a huge part of that solidarity. I think it seems to me, at least, because of states like Pakistan and a lot of Northern Africa and stuff like that, all getting that massive amount of aid and that kind of solidarity. Also, as far as reading the article, when I read the conclusion, I kind of got the sense that there was going to be some kind of need to restructure the world order to include the coalition of the Global South. As in, you'd really need to restructure either the World Bank or the IMF or institutions like that, because the Global South is going to exist and keep existing and rise kind of as a unit, and that the current systems don't include them. which is
Right.
inherently is going to come to a head.
But do you see where that's my, and I'm speculating a little bit. By the way, I'll get it to in just a sec. Kat just made a great point here by way of wrapping up. But the idea being that, they have one asset they didn't have before. They have China as a wonderful engine of capital. I don't know how many of you looked at chat, but, Kat said the article argues that they, Global South, don't simply maintain this bond because they were all labeled as poor at one point, but they maintain a bond because they back each other in international affairs due to shared experiences such as being colonized, having similar regimes, social behaviors. That's a great point. By the way, one of the really recent examples of that that's been quite striking has been when you look at sub-Saharan Africa with respect to COVID. They're experiencing right now a dramatic shortage of vaccines. There's one reason for that, primarily. It's not merely that very few places in sub-Saharan Africa have facilities to develop the vaccine. Actually, that can be done. It's that the primary, overwhelmingly, the source of their vaccines was India. And now India, having this new explosion of cases, has had to stop exporting a lot of the vaccines. But that was a classic South-South kind of mutual aid thing, just like what Kat's describing, where, India had that long experience of British colonialism and having essentially to go to war with Britain to kick them out. Kenya had the same thing. It's interesting that, it's that part of it is that shared experience, not merely of being poor, but of having been marginalized and having to fight to overcome that, to search out some other kind of sovereignty or alliance that isn't dominated by Western Europe, Britain, and the United States, right? And that's why I think that China is such a key player here, where, for example, Russia is not a key player here. Brazil is really not a key player. They're more a beneficiary of this than I think the core of this, though, could be arguably China. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is in part because I don't think it's emphasized here, and it's a difference of opinion, and I can accept that. But also because, China's going to be an engine of economic growth for decades to come, Now, the big challenge for China right now is, can they continue, to consume energy at the levels they have? It looks like they're not going to have to, because they bought up most of the American technology for, fuel cells and solar cells and things like that, and they now own it. So they'll probably be a world beater in green technology, where we will fall behind. We lost 4 key years, and before that, 8 key years. By 8 years of George W. Bush really not quite getting with the program, but not really shutting it down. We had 8 years of Obama trying to get it going, and then we had 4 years of absolutely lopping it off at the knees. So, during that stretch, right, of that 20-year run, China's done nothing but invest heavily. And where are they sending it? The rest of the developing world. Okay, and again, it's not to paint China as wonderful people. This isn't about normative values and who's nice and who's not. This is about global power. It's like when I was talking about Eritrea. It's not about whether or not Eritreans are nice people. That's not the point. The point is, why are they doing what they're doing, and what are the consequences of what they're doing? So whatever you may think of China and communism and command capitalism and all that, one legacy of that, right, is this notion of this solidarity and self-reliance that persists in the global South, which is what Kat was talking about. I'm really sorry that we couldn't hear you better, because you were making some great, I was making notes. I hope I wasn't clattering away too much, but you made, and you hit all the high notes and everything, but it was just really hard to hear you. And that's a shame, All right, but does that argument make sense? Again, as with all of these things, not do you agree with it, does it make sense as an argument of why that would be so important to the calculations we would make in terms of, international alliances, global politics, comparative politics, economics, this notion of the global South as being meaningful, not merely because of a shared experience of poverty, but because of the consequences, some of these countries escaping the inertial drag of that poverty and beginning to do some pretty extraordinary things, however limited they may be in some ways. And then, of course, the big one in the room is China. China is going to change the world, whether you like it or not. They are changing the world in a way that Amazon's changing the world, because they have these this economic engine of scale that we've really never seen before come out of Asia or out of too many places in the world, you know. And I mean, when you look at, you know, China produces a lot of junk. They produce a lot of like cheap finished goods and stuff like that. But China also produces some of the finest, you know, consumer durables on the planet that are affordable to whom? The American middle class. Why? Because American wages have been more or less stable and static for 40 years. Okay. And we wouldn't have the same advantages as a middle class, right? We wouldn't have, you know, all the technology we're using to communicate in this classroom right now would probably be beyond the reach of any of us right now, if not for China. Because, you know, their labor costs are lower, their manufacturing costs are at scale, and so they achieve efficiencies through scale, and they happen to produce good stuff, you know. This is where Japan was in the 70s and 80s. You know, I mean, I have vivid memory of when Japan emerged as not merely like a producer of cheap stuff. You know, the joke used to be, you'd see old cartoons, you'll see this sometimes, where there will be something manufactured, and you turn it over and they'll say made in Japan, and that used to be a joke. Made in Japan now means, other than made in Germany, it means, oh, that's like the finest electronic stuff in the world. Well, China's going to be there. You know who's not going to be there? The United States. Whatever else we do, we're not going to be there, because we've deindustrialized, arguably, during that same period of time. So all of these forces are moving. And the point of this unit, this module, is all these global forces of politics and economics are moving. And they make this kind of turmoil, as though, you know, the international environment was fluid, was like an ocean, right? And some people bob up to the top and they learn to swim and they float along and they, you know, they have a great time. Some people are floundering and drowning. Okay. What Kat's discussion suggests is that there is potential in the global south for that, a variation of that high tide lifts all boats things, where the high tide is China. And if they continue to invest in the developing world in the way that they have over the last 25 years, they will by themselves change the global south in terms of the global power structure. They will change it. You know, another power could emerge in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, another power could emerge in Southeast Asia. It could very well be, you know, like Vietnam or something. Could all of a sudden be, strategically, it could be another Korea. It could. This despite the fact that there are centuries of animosity between, say, Vietnam and China. But you know what? It's kind of hard to say no to certain kinds of development, to certain opportunities, to certain possibilities. So that's what that's all about. That was a good presentation. Thank you. That was interesting. All right. Any questions? A lot of information.
I kind of had a sort of off-topic question about like IR theory and controlling China and like India and stuff like that. And the idea of like there are some IR theorists that basically go the way that the US contains China is through like a four-way alliance of like Japan, Australia, and India. And so the idea that like India might not be as cohesive in the global south as, or they might act partially as part of the global south, but also help the global north potentially in some ways.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. My interpretation would be slightly different, would be that since independence, India has been steadfastly non-aligned. India never took a side in the Cold War. They were the leader in the non-aligned movement. And they had the better part of it now, more than 1 billion people to back that up, right? So, yeah, I mean, India has sort of tried desperately to chart its own course. And that course has been as straight down the middle as they can get. You know, they'll veer here and there. For example, India wants the support of the West and particularly of the United States with respect to the disputed territory of Kashmir and the disposition of Pakistan, right? So India relies on the United States to be an honest broker and something of a referee with respect to how we treat Pakistan, which is a reflection of how we treat Afghanistan and how we operate in South Asia. India is very aware of that. India is relying on us in a sense to cover that flank for them, right? And as a consequence of that, we can rely on India not to deploy its nuclear arsenal. You know, I mean, yeah. So it's a great, Kyle, it's a great point, and it's a long discussion. But sure, I would say this is the legacy of India pursuing decades of an attempt to remain non-aligned. The difference being now that the alignment is not the Soviet Union, which is no more, and there's no interest in Russia. Okay, the alignment issue now probably would be EU, China, United States, developing world, parts of the developing world. And there is, as you say, that kind of, excuse me, that kind of Pacific alliance where you bring in Australia and you bring in, you know, I suppose New Zealand just because of where they are, but they're not exactly an economic power. You know, does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, it's non-alignment, I would argue, the legacy of that. Yeah, but that's more IR than comparative, but still, it's all relevant. It's all grist in the mill. All right, any other questions? Okay, we're just about out of time. And so I wanted to remind you again, oh, assignment, yes. You have an assignment due. It's not due until a week from today. It's due Tuesday. I believe it's the 1st of June. That's available now. Just take any two of the assignments or any two of the reading assignments and talk about, you can see, I'm asking you to just do what we've just done in this presentation. You know, time together. Okay, simple stuff. From here on in, I would recommend that you not have any more late papers or miss any more deadlines. We're just running out of time. And I really, 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 really don't want to have to give out incompletes. They just don't get made up. You forget the stuff and they never get finished. Okay. So next week this time, we'll meet, we'll discuss the debate topic. You can pick some sides. We'll put you in breakout rooms. And then you can develop some strategies, and then the following week we'll have an in-class debate. And I'll tell you sort of how we're going to run that mechanically using Zoom. It might even be easier using Zoom, come to think of it. Right, anything else? All right, then I'll see you next week.
Thank you.